All right, well, we're here today with Dr. Donald Kraybill. This interview is taking place at Elizabethtown College in the High Library. Our start time is 1:45 p.m. on October 31st, 2022. The interviewer is Rachel Grove Rohrbaugh, myself, and Abigail Sholes, a student here at Elizabethtown College. Thank you again, Don, for agreeing to sit down and answer some questions for us and help us gain some context for your extensive papers that you've donated to the college archives.
I'm very happy to be here and really look forward to our time together.
Yes, thank you very much. All right, so we're going to start with just some background on your relationships with the Amish and other plain communities. So first of all, when and how did your first academic interest in Amish and Mennonite groups begin?
My first academic interest would have been with the Mennonites in 1970 in graduate school. I did my dissertation on the Mennonite High School in Lancaster County. It was a 3-year project tracking them from when they entered to when they were leaving. It was a 3-year thing. So that was my dissertation, and then I wrote a number of books related to Mennonite education after that. And so my interest in Mennonite studies would go back 50 years basically. My first book was indirectly about Mennonites, called Our Star-Spangled Faith, at the time of the bicentennial. That was and the Mennonite church had asked me to write it. It was like a critique of civil religion. Part of the background here is that I was born in Mount Joy, Pennsylvania, just a few miles from here, and born into a Mennonite farm family. And so I had the Mennonite experience, obviously, growing up in this area, at least my first 8 years, and then we moved to another farm south of Lancaster when I was 8, and then continued to attend a Mennonite church, but a different congregation.
So you had a family background
Yes.
as a Mennonite, yes. Where did your first academic interest in the Amish begin?
My first academic interest in the Amish came, oddly, through the filming of the Paramount film, The Witness. And my professor, who chaired my dissertation committee at Temple University, was John A. Hostetler. And he was the leading authority on the Amish at that time in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But I wasn't really interested in the Amish. He had me do some research. I was his research assistant on the Hutterites, but so I didn't really get interested until about 1984, 85. So my interest in the Mennonites is over a 50-year period now, and so it's more like a 40-year period since my interest in the Amish.
And how did the film Witness really spark your...
Yeah, well, it's really odd because I just never cared much about the Amish. There was a negative feeling toward them among the Mennonites, like in my home. Even like we were on a farm, and my dad would say these Amish are crazy, like not having tractors out in the field. And I remember going to the burial of my grandfather, and some of the family members, some of the guys actually my age, I would have been maybe 25 at that point, started shoveling dirt over the casket in the graveyard, and one of my uncles said, well, that's a dumb Amish way to do it. So there was that negative. I didn't grow up with any respect for the Amish, is another way to say it. But I was teaching here at Elizabethtown College at that point and taught a course in sociology, introductory sociology. And one of the course books I used was Marvin Harris, an anthropologist, this wonderful book called Cows, Pigs, and Witches and Other Riddles of Human Culture. So I got this idea of riddles and how the things that are incongruent in a culture look like a riddle to outsiders. And so then I realized, well, that's kind of like how the Amish treat cars. Like they won't allow you to own a car or drive a car, but they'll allow you to ride in one and hire a driver, which to outsiders looks hypocritical. So that's kind of like stirred I said, well, there's something interesting here. And then about that time, the Witness film came out, and John Hostetler was actively involved in that. And then we ended up writing an article together on the ethics of film related to the Amish. So that's how I got started, basically.
Was it not long after that that you started thinking about your book, Riddle of Amish Culture?
Yeah, that book came out in 1989, and so I got started thinking about it probably in 1984, 85, and then actually once I got into it, I really got excited about it and realized how fascinating all these little riddles were. I mean, it wasn't just cars, there's dozens of other riddles that to outsiders look weird and don't make sense. And so I got really, so it would have been, I'm just guessing here, 84, 85 when I started doing the field work. I was fortunate to get a grant from the NEH for a year that really helped me. And what was odd about that, I had proposed a project to them to do a comparison in the 20th century from 1880 to 1980, comparing Amish, Mennonites, and Brethren just in Lancaster County. And my argument was that since they're in the same environment, similar backgrounds, very, very similar in 1880, what explains how they've changed in such radically different directions, these three groups, in the 20th century? And so there was a good book available on the Brethren and a good book available on the Mennonites. But there was not a good scholarly book on the Amish. I thought, well, I think I'm going to do a book on the Amish. So I talked to my editor, not the editor, but the grants director at not Johns Hopkins, but the National Endowment for the Humanities. I said, look, they had awarded me the grant, to do this three-way thing. And I said, I need to do a book on the Amish first. And they said, that's fine, just go ahead and do it. They were very, very generous and very adaptable like that. So that's how it started.
So a lot of doing research with the Amish is, of course, actually doing field work. You're a sociologist. So you're also developing relationships with people. So how have your relationships with Amish individuals and communities grown and changed over time, over these decades of doing this research? So
there are a lot of things within the Amish communities that have changed over this 40-year period of time. I think, well, the one thing that changed, obviously, is over time I developed dozens and dozens of relationships with Amish people. Like when I first started, I actually frankly didn't know any. But my mentor at Johns Hopkins, my mentor at Temple, Dr. John Hostetler, he introduced me to an Amish person that really became a mentor to me in some ways. And so gradually my network of relationships with Amish people grew, and now today, like, I have hundreds of friends, across the country, like, where I can go out and they'll put me up overnight. I mean, I had a case in Ohio a couple years ago, going to meet with a bishop, and I was going to stay there overnight. And then he called and left a phone message. He said, we aren't going to be home till midnight tonight. We have a special meeting. So just go in, make yourself at home, just go to bed. The dog won't hurt you. He's retired. he's friendly. So, and to have that kind of welcome is very meaningful. So I've developed a lot of warm friendships like that, which I didn't have at first. And I say the second thing is I've learned a lot of techniques about interviewing and how to present myself and what to say and what not to say that really make me feel much more comfortable and confident, I guess is the better word, confident, to meet them and talk with them. But I don't know if you want to hear some of my tricks of the trade out.
Sure.
So if the last thing I would ever do if I wanted to contact an Amish person cold would be to call up and say, hey, I want to make an appointment to interview you for a project about the smartphone. That'd be the worst thing to do. I mean, they would probably hang up the phone. So if I didn't know the person, I might write to them in advance or call and leave a message and tell them to call me back, or find some way to make an initial contact. Or I may just go to their home and show up. Often just showing up works better than trying to make an appointment. So I would say visit with you. Would you be willing to visit with me for a little while next Wednesday? Because I have a project I'm working on and I need help to understand it. Yeah, sure, that's fine. So the word visit is the most important, and then helping me. They'll want to be friendly and be a helper. And I won't mention what the project is at that point, so they don't really know. And I'm very careful with my dress. I don't try to dress like an Amish person. That would be offensive and foolish and stupid on my part. But I try to dress plain. I mean, wear certain clothing and wear certain set of shoes, nothing shiny, so I'm really sensitive to the clothing that I wear. And then when I get there, let's say I do want to study the smartphone. I'm really interdisciplinary. I'm sociology and history and religious studies. So I would say to them, I would like to talk about history related to the telephone. Do you remember your grandparents talking about telephones? And so, oh yeah, sure. Well, what were the understandings in your church community? And I'd never say, well, what do you think about a smartphone? Or what do you think? I'd never ask them what they think. I just say, like, tell me about what was going on, with your grandparents. And so that'll get us going for a half an hour and kind of like work our way down. And then at some point I might say, well, these phones now that you carry around, these smartphones, what I would say, what does the church think of that, or how does the church handle that? But not what do you think about it? So anyway, those are some tricks of the trade. Saying the right words, keeping the hardest thing for two things that are really hard for me. One is I talk too fast when I'm with them, and so I just like outside the door say, Kraybill, slow it down. Slow it down. So that's one thing. The other thing is to try to get rid of my academic jargon and use just really basic English, and try to be empathetic, and supporting them and so on. So I don't know if that makes sense, but those are some of the things that I think I have improved on over the years and have made me much more effective as an interviewer.
I think that leads pretty well into our next question. Have you had any interesting stories or interactions with Amish people as part of your research that you'd like to share?
Yeah, like I actually gave a whole presentation on humor and funny things that happened, and I don't know where to start or stop on this, but so I've attended a lot of church services, and in this one, I just wasn't paying attention. I know better. When they sing in the church service, they have like a leader who sings out, the first syllable, a couple syllables of a song, and then the congregation repeats, to get the song started. So he's like alone singing, and then the congregation comes and joins him. So I knew this, and I just wasn't paying attention. And I'm sitting in the church service up beside this leader, and he starts out, and I just join him. And he gave me a big poke in the ribs with his elbow. So I was so embarrassed. I mean, I knew better, I just wasn't wasn't thinking. Another one that comes to mind, around nickel mines, I developed a really close friendship with a man and woman in nickel mines who were first responders and then worked with the community for a long time. And I ended up taking students down there to visit with them and so on. And so one day I'm speaking with this woman, and she and her husband had trusted me and so on, and I'm in her house alone speaking with her, interviewing her about something. And then she said, you know, Don, some days I just wish I could ride around a little red convertible. I said, really? She said, yeah, well, don't put that in the book. Don't put that in the book. So I have it. I put it other places, but never in a book. It was just fascinating to me that she thinks about that and thought it would just be fun to have that sense of freedom driving around in the open air in this red convertible. Another time, I'm in Iowa and it's early in the morning, and there was a new settlement there about 25 miles away from where I was staying overnight with an Amish family. But I wanted to go to this new settlement because in this new settlement there was a man that edited a newsletter that went to several different states, and it was really valuable for me to get the information from this newsletter. It was called The Grapevine. So I got up at 5 a.m. in the morning. I never met this guy. I didn't tell him I was coming. I just learned the night before where he was and how to find him. And so I get up and drive for about an hour and finally get to what I thought I was sure it was his place. And he and his wife were living in a small trailer, like a house trailer. They were just kind of getting started with things. And so so I walked up and knocked on the door, and he answered, and I forget his name. I said, are you Mr. Miller? I said, are you the editor of the Gossip Vine? He said, Gossip Vine? No, I said, I mean the grapevine, not the Gossip Vine. It was like the worst way, but it was so bad, we both laughed, and it kind of actually, I think, opened up the door to a good interview, because he cooperated and talked to me, and so and his wife's laughing in the background. But it was the most foolish introduction I've ever made in an interview. So anyway, those are a couple.
Well, actually, it sounds like in that particular case, sort of your flub ended up leading to something that went well. Can you reflect on any experiences you've had with Amish people not being comfortably being interviewed?
Yeah, I would say it's hard for me to believe this, but I'm fairly certain it's true that there was one person in Lancaster County that refused an interview. And the reason was, I knew his father very well and his parents, and he knew what I was doing. He was like, he understood how I was doing interviews, and it was, you know, he wasn't upset. He just said, you know, he said, I don't really have time to talk to you. He said, I don't want to be in any of your research. You know, he wasn't mean. He was just straightforward, but he knew really what was going on. But that's remarkable. I'm talking across the country. I don't remember. The only other one that I remember who interviewed with me, but he wouldn't let me in the house. So this is like a conservative, and I made a mistake. And this is another thing I should have mentioned. I often, before I go to visit with someone, I will go into the Amish newspapers and look up who was writing things about their community before I get there. I also look at the directory if I have it to see, is this going to be a minister or a bishop, or they have 4 kids or 12 or whatever. And in this case, it was in upper New York State, and it was a cold evening, and I had found out that this guy was a scribe for some of the papers, and I read all the stuff up on him, and I never should have mentioned that, because then I think he was out at the barn, and I said, do you have time to talk a little bit? And he said, well, I'm pretty busy. He said, well, let's get started, something like that. And then I rattled off all I knew about him, which was just the wrong thing to do. So he said, well, let's go over and we can talk on the porch. And this is cold. It's like 25-degree weather. So he answered my questions. He wouldn't let me in the house or into a heated area. He was uncomfortable because he knew what I knew and was, you know, this outsider that knows all. It's like the FBI comes to interview you and you know they know everything about you. So that was a mistake. I mean, he on my part, and he just, he was gracious. I mean, he talked, but you could tell he was eager to have it wrapped up.
It's interesting, though, that he didn't cut it off completely.
Yeah, it is. You know, I think he was curious. Part of this is they're curious too to know, well, what are you interested in? What do you know? But I just shouldn't have rattled so much stuff off. So anyway.
So thinking about your research on the Amish, but then also on all the other projects you've done, because you've explained you worked on other things related to Mennonites and other topics. Right. Which project of yours was the most challenging to research?
I think of two things. The one is technology. So like I was hoping to write a book on technology. And in the archives here at the Hess Archives, you have, I think, some of the chapters of that book. But the more I got into it, it was so complicated because there's like, you know, 40 different Amish groups, Amish tribes, so to speak. And there's dozens, hundreds of settlements, like 2,500 different, 2,500 different congregations, and they have some autonomy on technology. So I just got overwhelmed by it. It was so complicated, and I never finished it. So that was challenging, so challenging I didn't do it. The other one that was very challenging was the book that Steve Nault and Karen Johnson Weiner and I wrote called The Amish. And that I think has maybe 18 or 19 chapters, and it was the first attempt to write a book that covered all the Amish settlements in the United States and Canada. And John Hoster in 1968 in his book Amish Society, or maybe it was that was a later edition, I think it was 63 or 65, the first one. He tried to do that, but he focused just on Lancaster County, central Pennsylvania, Big Valley, and I believe Ohio, if I remember. So we had this just gigantic task. I mean, Karen and Steve and I, of trying to cover all of the communities, and it was just overwhelming. I think I'm very pleased with the book. I mean, I think we we did, you know, as good as we possibly could, given all the uniquenesses and distinctions and so on. So, but it would have been the most challenging of all the books.
Which of you most interesting or surprising to research?
I would say Amish Grace, the book that Steve and I and David Weaver Zerker wrote after the nickel mines tragedy, because it was just amazing to be close and involved in that community after this terrible tragedy. And they were remarkably willing to talk. And I learned a whole lot about their spirituality that I never knew before. I mean, I've been writing books. I think the book came out in 2007. I think it was October 2nd, 2006, when the event took place. I'm not sure where I'm going with this. So they were willing to talk, and what was hard for us to know, we got several invitations to write a book, separately, the three of us. And we thought, well, this is crazy for three of us to do three different books, so why don't we cooperate? And so we did. But then we felt, how would we feel if we had this terrible tragedy happen and our children, some of them were severely damaged, or some of them died. have some outside person coming in and doing this. And so we talked with them about it, and we thought, well, maybe we can return some of the royalties to their fund. There was a fund set up to help the parents because of all the medical costs that they were going to have. And they said, no, we don't want a benefit from that. But they agreed. I said, well, what should we do with it? And they said, well, send it to MCC, Mennonite Central Committee. And so all the proceeds, every nickel from that, in terms of our royalties, went to Mennonite Central Committee, who is a developmental agency around the world, and this was specifically to support children who are victims of disease, fire, their migrants, or their special needs children would have around the world. So that they were very gracious to do that. And again, everything that I had written up to that point was a cultural description of the Amish. And this really shifted my awareness to their spirituality that I didn't comprehend before. And so ever since that time, my writings have taken into account much more their spirituality as well as their cultural habits and cultural customs. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but and then we actually did a sequel book called I forget the name of it, a book on Amish spirituality called The Amish Way, Patience in a Modern World or something like that, but it's a sequel to the Amish Grace book.
And some of those things that you learned about their spirituality were surprising to you, that were beyond what you'd really
Yeah, I just didn't get it. I mean, I didn't understand the forgiveness thing at all. And then when I start digging in, I see, well, it's around every corner. That it's in a prayer that they say before each meal. Prayer, the first prayer the children learn, the Lord's Prayer. And so it was just a lot of stuff there that I had not looked for before and didn't realize, about forgiveness, or didn't realize, many things related to how they process church things and make decisions, and how that's connected to their understanding of certain scriptures and so on. We have a chapter in the book, it's like we get this call, well, we got a letter or call from somebody, I think a letter said, why is it that the Amish forgive people that kill their children, but they won't forgive a woman who's baptized and marries an English person? So we ended up doing a whole chapter on that, which really gets at their spirituality and how they make a distinction between one of their members who's baptized and somebody in the outside world who's not Amish at all and has not been baptized, so they have nothing to break. And also their sense that the outside world, the criminal justice system, is responsible to bring justice to the perpetrators. So anyway, a lot of stuff there.
So we were just talking earlier, you were serving as an expert witness for a trial. You've done this on other occasions, but probably one of the most notable, and ended up being the basis for one of your book projects, was the Bergholtz beard cutting case. Can you tell us about your experience being an expert witness for that trial, and maybe other experiences being an expert witness?
So I think it was 2011, I believe, when the Bergholtz, and let me just back up and say, there was an Amish bishop that basically set up a cult in southern Ohio, sort of in the mountainous area there, set up this cult and got himself ordained as a minister and then ordained as a bishop. And it was all suspicious. I mean, he was all alone doing this, and so it meets the definition of a cult, where he's controlling people by force. It's just not a pretty situation. And so all the other Amish ministers and bishops had a one-day meeting in that area. Like it would have been northern Pennsylvania and Ohio. It was, there was like 300 or so of them. And they all agreed unanimously to strip him of his office and authority to excommunicate people. And so that made him really angry. And so eventually he started going around with some of his adherents. A good number of them were family members, going around cutting beards at night of other people, because the beard is a symbol of sort of wisdom, and particularly older men who are ministers or bishops would have a long white beard. And so they made 5 or 6 attacks in different counties. And I remember this one, I interviewed some of the victims, and one of these bishops said, I didn't go to church for 6 or 8 weeks. I was so shameful and embarrassed. And so anyway, they get charged eventually with federal hate crimes. So I actually was employed by the U.S. government. The U.S. prosecutor was in Cleveland, and so I worked with him because they couldn't figure out. There's like 6 or 7 different Amish groups. They're in different states out there, different counties, excuse me, and they don't know who's who and what's what. And so it was very interesting, but so I met with him a number of times, and then I was expert witness at the trial. And that was very interesting because I had the equivalent of 2 days in the courtroom. And the judge, by the way, is Jewish, and he knows a lot about beard wearing. So it was really a great fit. I mean, he was very sympathetic and just understood and knew because of his Jewish background and reading the Jewish Bible. He was, So anyway, so I'm there on the witness stand, and as I look out to the back of the room, there are 16 defendants, okay, that are all charged in this trial, and they have an attorney beside each one. So I'm talking and having to be very careful what I say and how I say it, because then, the prosecutor is asking me questions first, but then in the cross-examination, these attorneys, can jump in, and I'm getting stuff from every end, and so it was actually exciting in some ways, but it was also very scary. The one thing that was really sad about this, going back to interviews, I interviewed a number of the people that were in this cult and left, and these are family members actually of Sam Mullet, and they would move away, and I tracked them down, and they said, well, yeah, but will you promise not to say, you won't say anything? I don't want them to know where we live. And they're kind of like, well, will you promise not to tell anybody, or, So it was really frightening to see how anxious they were, and how, anxious and afraid of this cult leader.
Are there any specific topics relating to Amish and Mennonite groups that interest you, that you've not written about, or you feel should be studied more?
Yeah, there's a couple things. One of the things that has never been studied, and I think it has a big influence on the Amish, is their relationships to the van drivers, English van drivers that take them around. And they're usually neighbors, not necessarily always neighbors, but they travel with them a lot, and they have a radio on in the car. And I think these outside people who, again, are driving vans to take them places, have a lot of influence on them. And no one has ever studied that. There are a lot of things about the Amish that are not uniquely Amish, but they're early 20th century rural Pennsylvania things. And so these van drivers are also generally rural people. And I think on politics, on just attitudes toward a lot of stuff, the van drivers reflect themselves actually rural, early mid-20th century thinking. And I think it reinforces what the Amish think and actually maybe changes and makes, or they are, another way to say it is, they are instead of having television, the Amish, these van drivers are a primary source of influence of what to think politically, because they're not watching television. Some do and some don't have a smartphone or things like that. So anyway, that's one topic. Another topic would be the different tribes and groups of Amish. And it's so complicated because within a particular tribe, so to speak, there may be 6 or 7 sub-tribes. And how they're related to each other and so on is really complicated. Edsel Burge at the Young Center, he's working on that. But I think it's important and it's complicated to figure out who's in fellowship with whom and why and so on, or who's in the outs with another subgroup and why they're not communicating, why they're not in fellowship with them or holding communion with them, or why they won't let their ministers preach in their church and so on. The other thing might be more study of ex-Amish, of why they left. There are some ex-Amish who've written their books, and there are some that are bitter, or they may have experienced some kind of abuse in a family, and so they have really negative stories, which is understandable. But I think some more sort of unbiased academic studies would be helpful.
So over the decades you've spent researching and writing on Amish and Mennonite groups, what big changes have you noticed over time? I'd
say the biggest one is what, Steve Nolt and I wrote a book about it. I think it came out in the 1990s. But it is what I would call a mini industrial revolution. It's huge, and it was the biggest change in my life studying the Amish over 40 years. It was the singular biggest change that's having an ongoing impact on Amish life. Meaning they aren't farming, only about a third of them or fewer are actually farming or getting their livelihood from the farm, but they're running small businesses, they're employed in small businesses. There are thousands of these, and they're very successful, very successful. And so that has been, without parallel, the biggest and most significant change that I've seen during my 40 years of studying the Amish.
What do you think is the most common misconception about the Amish? Or maybe more than one.
Well, I could give you 10. I actually have, well, I won't do the 10, but in this little book, I did a little book on the Amish of Lancaster County and actually start near the front on the 10 myths or something. Well, one is what I've just said, that people tend to think they're farmers. You know, visitors who don't know Lancaster County or haven't worked with them very much tend to think that they are all farmers, when in fact, probably only 20% are, even nationally, 20–25%. The other one, another big one is a lot of people think they don't pay their taxes, which is not true. So on and on. So.
How did your research on the Amish and other plain groups impact your teaching at Elizabethtown College?
It made my teaching really fun. I was just so fortunate to be doing this research, and so I had seminars, every semester a seminar, either on Anabaptist groups in general or on the Amish, and that meant we went on field trips, and so I was fresh with new ideas. I had an Amish friend that would come and sit in my classes and spend, 3 hours with us. And then we'd go out on a Saturday and maybe visit 3 or 4 different families or homes, and often would end up with a meal in an Amish home. It was just the greatest environment for teaching that I can imagine. I mean, it was just kind of like everybody was energized, everybody was, was in. And I just had so much fun. I remember this isn't the Amish, but there's a similar group called the German Baptist Brethren, which is a old order group from the Church of the Brethren, and they have a meeting house in southern Lebanon County, and they would invite us to come for their service. So I would take like 2 van loads up there and have service there. I mean, this is like a 2.5-hour worship service. Now it's in English, so students could understand it. And then after that, we'd break up and go to 3 or 4 different families, and they'd make us a free lunch. We'd talk and play some games, and they were really into Dutch Blitz. And they were teaching the students Dutch Blitz. It's like a card game. But I remember coming home with one group, and the group that I had in my car, I don't know if it was a car or a van, it was a van, were women. Most of them were women, maybe not all. And they said, on the way home, they said, they just can't believe it, that these women just love having children and doing dishes and making meals and sewing. They just are so happy doing this stuff. And it was kind of like, it had never occurred to them that, to my students, how the values might be so different in another group, because in their mind, they were college students. Those were the last things they wanted to be doing. They wanted to get their degree and get on to a professional job or graduate school or whatever. But it illustrates the power of how those field trips can demonstrate how different cultures have different values and ways of understanding what's good and wonderful and what's not.
You were so perfect that you were right here in
I was
to be able to go on those.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I learned, and I had such good access, to all these people. I would just call them up and say, hey, could we come out and, talk, will you talk with us? And they would, they had learned to trust me the leaders, Amish people or old order people, had learned to trust me and say, so they knew that I wouldn't embarrass them or shame them or whatever. And so that just gave me wonderful access. So I'm very fortunate.
Yeah. So as someone who's local for me, the area, I was interested in the tourism area and the tourism region, especially in Lancaster and Chester counties. So in your years studying the Amish, have you noticed, especially in this region, changes in how that tourism industry is perceived and participated in by different Amish groups? Yeah,
and that has changed dramatically over the last 40 years. So the tourism was, so I'm thinking actually, in some ways, the thing that really gave tourism a big boost was the film Witness. Again, that's coming out in the mid, 84, 85, okay? And frankly, that has a big impact on Europe. If I go to Europe and I'm in an elevator in a hotel or something and people say, where are you from? And I would say Lancaster County. Is that where the Amish are? Yeah, I say, well, we saw Witness. They know Witness. And the Japanese, the same thing. I spent a week, 10 days over there giving lectures. So that was gave a big boost, in a sense, to tourism, the film. But in the 70s, there would be little farm stands along the road and some handicrafts, but not much at all. Now there's just like, everything's flooded with it. And the Amish are much more invested in it. There's a lot of, I don't know what the right word is here, but invaders, outside people that market under the Amish label. Like it's like chicken from Amish country. Well, it's a chicken that's never been inside an Amish farm and no one has ever touched it, but it's like chicken from Amish country, and it's sold in New York City when everybody thinks it's good. But it's just, so there are outside entrepreneurs that have abused the market. But there are another example of how invested Amish people are. There's a tourist place along Route 340 east of Lancaster, and this is an Amish family that owns a horse and buggy ride company. And so they have they own this company, and they have Amish drivers riding. The tourists, 3 or 4 or 5 of them, get in the buggy, and they would take off and have a 20-minute ride or half-hour ride in the countryside. That would never have happened in 1970. I mean, it would have been abhorrent to think that they were going to get invested. So you're exactly right. It is really mushroomed, and it's much bigger than it had been. But I would say the Amish just kind of deal with it. It's kind of like, yeah, it is what it is, and so yes.
Okay. Going off of that a little bit, you had been talking earlier about your experience with the film Witness and kind of the ethics of film and media surrounding Amish culture. So how aware have you found Amish people to be about their representations in film, and especially misrepresentations, and what are their reactions?
Yeah. You need to remember, they're not going to theaters. They don't watch television unless they're watching the World Series when the Phillies are playing. Then they watch, maybe go over to a neighbor's house. So they don't have access, actually. They have very little access to very little access to knowing how they are being represented in film, okay? Just because they don't have access to that kind of media. I would say that they were aware of The Witness because there was a lot of publicity about it in the newspaper. I'm not sure how many really saw it. But the one thing that they did where they were extremely mistreated was with Amish Mafia. And everybody knew that. Everybody was talking. And they didn't see much, but their neighbors would talk about it, and they might see some, if the neighbor might invite them over to see. But to them, it was just stupid. How stupid can outsiders be? And how dumb is this? So they kind of like laughed it off and mocked it, or some were angry about it. But I would say it was kind of like, well, it's so dumb and stupid, and how weird can outsiders be? Now, the other thing that was tricky with that is there were a lot of outside people that couldn't tell if it was the real thing or not. And the reason was that the people in Amish Mafia, a number of them had grown up Amish, and they knew the language, and they knew how Amish, how the culture functioned at different times and places. And so it seemed really real. And I got a dozen emails, more maybe, phone calls, saying, and from colleagues here at the college, professors, that is this thing real or isn't it? Is it made up? It just seems so accurate in some ways. So that's where I think it duped the outside world more than it did the Amish.
Interesting, thank you. You had also talked a little bit about one of the misconceptions about the Amish being that they're all farmers, and you had said that that was not true. So as we're kind of seeing more Amish people engaging in work and communicating with non-Amish people with the English, do you find that there are elements of code switching? And by that I mean, are there different ways of maybe speech, behavior, or appearance that Amish people go into a non-Amish work setting, for example, that they might not necessarily behave or say or do when they are at home or
Right.
in the community?
Well, I would say, first of all, in terms of Pennsylvania Dutch, the language or the dialect, the language, there are more English words getting into that. I mean, the language is evolving, and so particular business people, I mean, they can talk about a balance sheet, talk about a financial plan for your business, on and on. Talk about the strategy for expanding. And so they have a lot of words like that that wouldn't even translate into Pennsylvania Dutch. So I'd say one area is the evolution of that. Yeah, and this gets a little tricky because so there are a lot of Amish that have delis, and there are Amish markets. So every day, or at least 3 days out of the week, they're meeting the public and interacting with the public. And so their behavior wouldn't appear much different in many ways than English people, partly because they see how they behave and they want to be able to relate to them. So I'm sure there's some rub off there, particularly, and now this wouldn't happen as much to a farmer or to somebody in a small carpenter shop or whatever, but particularly those who are interacting almost every day with the outside world, it rubs off. I have a friend that just recently was in a hour-long symposium with me here at the Young Center, and it was interesting for me to see how his behavior and what he said was different when he was speaking to that audience. These happened to be German journalists, 40 of them, and he was different than he would be if he was with me or with his family. So yes, there's some of that, and I would say the amount of it is probably in direct correlation with how much contact people have, again, with the outside world on a daily basis.
You worked with American Experience for the PBS documentary, The Amish. What was this experience like? How did it compare to working alone or co-writing with other scholars?
Mm-hmm. I would say, just looking back over everything, this is one of the most important things I did while I was working in Amish Studies and at the Young Center. And the background of it is that the director of the American Experience in Boston, he lived in this area, and so he knew about the Amish, learned about the Amish. Excuse me. He lived in this area and knew about the Amish. And he had reached out to me about 2000, I'm sure it's 3 or 4 or something like that, and said they were interested and would I be willing to meet with them. And then about 6 months later he said they can't go forward with this because of, I think, the economy at that point. And so he said maybe later, but I don't know. But then later, and I think this, I forget the date. You don't happen to remember, Rachel? We'll have to scrub this, but but it was before Amish Mafia, and I'm thinking it was more like 2008 or something like that. When I got a call one day and they said, could we come and talk to you next week because we're interested in doing this. So they flew down, a potential director and the director of the American Experience flew down to Baltimore got a car and got up to the Young Center by 10 o'clock, and then we went out driving, spent about 6 hours together. They went back to Baltimore and flew back to Boston. So it was a one-day fast trip. But they were really eager at that point, and so that's what got it started. I think it's one of the most important things I did, because there had not been any other films since one about 1970, which John Hostetler had worked on for Britannica Encyclopedia. And these guys, the American Experience people, the director of the film, worked very hard to get a good film and accurate, and so I was involved actually going out and contacting Amish people to see if they would be willing to be on this film. And if this had come about after Amish Mafia, nobody would have cooperated. We were extremely fortunate, because I would have said this is not for regular television and financial things. This is for a educational program across the country, and it's educational, and they just want to know the truth about Amish life and ways. And so I was able to get a lot, you know, at least a dozen Amish people here in Lancaster County who were willing to cooperate, willing to be on the film. Generally, they preferred not to have a face on, but to have their voice or to have background shadow or whatever. And they were very generous to do that. The one thing it sort of started out to be was going to be a focus on Lancaster. And I said to the film director, I said, you can't do that. I said, it's so narrow, and Lancaster is not, I mean, they're in a lot of 31 different states with a lot of different settlements. Stuff is different, and you need to get up in upper state New York, where Karen Johnson Weiner is, and she worked with him up there. Got some excellent images from there. They went to Ohio and then Indiana, and I said, you know, you need to go west. So they ended up going to Colorado. So in that sense, I felt like I really had influence over whether this is going to be a narrow little thing focused on Pennsylvania or a national thing. And they got out to Colorado and interviewed people out there. So I was so happy about that, and so glad they were willing to do that. They were good to work with. There's some options that I thought I suggested. I mean, I made a whole list of things, and some they took and some they didn't, of possible things to film, but that's okay. At the end, when they had the words describing, I forget what you call them, but it was like the script at the bottom of the screen. They gave those to me, and I was able to go through and review those and change some of them. So they were very generous in listening to my voice, and I think it is an excellent film. I should say the assistant director has a sister that lives in Lancaster, and she was not the sister but the assistant director. She was just superb. She had a quiet sense of building confidence and just did a superb job of helping Amish people feel comfortable with what they were doing. So again, if this had come after Amish Mafia, the film would not exist, because Amish Mafia just destroyed any Amish confidence in filmmaking. And frankly, if I've had one request, I've had 24 requests, you know, in the last 10 years from filmmakers around the world that want to come and think that I'm going to set up, you know, a deal. I said, you know, I just tell them, it's really hard work. You need to send an advanced person and spend 6 months here. And if you're not willing to invest in that, then just forget about making a film, because it's hard work.
You say that it's one of the most important things you've done. Is it just because of the reach of something like that, to have it on national television, that more people would
Yeah,
learn?
I feel like in terms of education, it was a national reach. I mean, and it ended up being representative. which is what of Amish across the country in many different forms and different tribes, from very conservative to very progressive. So you see in the shop, they actually, in Indiana, they're in these trailer shops, they actually speed up the things. And I should say that my good colleagues, Karen Johnson Weiner, David Weaver Zerker, Steve Nault, all were part of this. I mean, they were interviewed and interpreted a lot of the historical things, and they did an excellent job, and I'm so grateful for their help.
That actually leads into something, so thinking about all these people you've collaborated with over the years. So many in Amish studies cite you as a mentor, some of the people we've already interviewed. So who were your mentors in the field?
My non-Amish mentor, I'm going to answer, you said the field, so
Okay,
I don't know if that means the discipline or out in the field, so I'm going out into the field.
Okay.
So John A. Hostetler was my mentor in terms of Amish studies, and I went to Temple University to study with him, but I went there to study Mennonites. And so, but over the years then, after the Witness film came out, and we did some things together, then he introduced me to the person that I would call my primary first Amish mentor, and his name was Gid Fisher. And Gid Fisher wrote a book on farming in Lancaster County and its changes from an Amish perspective. He was retired, and I was just starting out, and John took me out to see him one day and said to him basically, "This is one of my students, so be good to him." So I went back at least 5 times for 2 to 3 hour interviews with Gid Fisher, and I'm guessing he was 75 at that point, 70, I'm not sure. But he just answered all of my questions, and he wasn't afraid to say anything, and it was just wonderful to have him help me get oriented to a whole lot of stuff that basically went into my first book, The Riddle of Amish Culture, and I dedicated that book to him. And I said, for Gid, who taught me, I don't know, something about the riddles or figured out the riddles for me. The other person that an Amish person that really mentored me was a bishop called Brownie. And Brownie did not live in nickel mines. He lived maybe 10 miles away, but he had friends there. And so he called me up at one point right after the nickel mines. He said, "Don," he said, "could I come and you want to go with me for a day and we'll just go out and visit Amish families around nickel mines?" I said, "I would be so honored to do that." Well, here he's a bishop taking me around, introducing me to all these families that had just suffered this horror. This is maybe 3 weeks afterwards, and it's kind of like, it just opened up doors and people knew him, and it was just astonishing. And that really helped us, David Weaver Zerker and Steve Nault and I, to write the book Amish Grace. We never would have been able to write it without having that kind of access to these people that were so traumatized by this whole thing.
Your scholarly papers reside here in the Hess Archives at Elizabethtown College. What are some notable parts of the collection?
Well, let me begin by saying the collection has a lot of stuff. I don't know how many linear feet, but there's a lot of stuff, and I will be eternally grateful to the Hess Archives for being interested in my things and organizing them so well. So one thing that I think is really strong is technology, and it's not all in this. It's organized in a number of different places and locations. But if someone's interested in Amish technology, there's an enormous amount of material there. Maybe even some chapters from the book on technology that I was working on. I'm not sure. So I'd say technology is one thing. I would say another example of what I would call sort of a gem that's there. I don't think anybody has ever studied, and either an academic researcher or student researchers might find it of interest. And that's a story from Kentucky where a man, this is from a conservative group, the state legislature in Kentucky was requiring that all Amish not wear, but attach a red triangle to the back of their buggy, okay? And this particular Amish group that I'll tell you about in a moment is very conservative. And they have parts of their groups living in other states where there's always been some conflict with this particular Schwarzentrooper group and the Red Triangle. So this Schwarzentrooper leader in Kentucky, he refused to do this, buy and attach a triangle, red triangle, orange red triangle to the back of his carriage. And he was arrested, and he was either going to jail, or I may have gone to jail for a couple days and was going to go back. And it became a big brouhaha in Texas, not Texas, in, where am I?
Kentucky?
Kentucky.
Right.
Sorry about that.
Oh, no.
In Kentucky. And, you know, nobody quite knew what to do. And so finally he ended up writing a letter, a handwritten letter, to all the legislature officials, elected people in the House of Representatives in Kentucky. And they changed their mind. And so we have that documentation in the Hess archives. And then he was so happy. I mean, he connected with me and called me, and he came up one day by bus from Kentucky to Harrisburg, and I met him and his wife there and took them out to visit some people. And he was just so excited to see me, and he was here at the Young Center. But no one has actually written that story up. There's another story related to forgiveness that has nothing to do with nickel mines, and that is there was a Mennonite man in Lancaster County maybe a dozen years ago who was driving over an icy steel bridge one morning and lost control of his car. He was going too fast, and at the other end of that bridge was a school teacher walking to her school, and he hit her and she died. And so this collection is a collection of dozens of letters from Amish people across the United States who are writing to this Mennonite man who had killed the teacher, saying, "We forgive you," and explaining why they forgive him. So that is a collection that I don't think has ever been studied, and is so there's dozens of gems like that in the collection that you know, would be of great value to scholars or students that want to study a particular topic, or just go through it and find surprises.
Yeah. I do find that when students are taking the general Amish studies, whatever their topic for their research papers, there's usually at least some section of the collection that they can.
Another example of something that's in there are mental health issues. Oh, yeah. I think there's a good collection of documents, you know, for students, a number of students interested in students with special needs and that sort of thing.
So we really do want to thank you for donating your papers and taking the time to participate in this interview. Is there anything else you'd like to share about your collection or your scholarship?
I feel extraordinarily fortunate to be at the Young Center when I was. And so there are a number of things that I feel very grateful for, and I feel like I've had lucky breaks, so to speak. If you look at a number of my books, they're co-authored. And I've had some just wonderful people to work with. I'm thinking Steve Nault, Karen Johnson Weiner, David Weaver Zerker, and others who I've written books with or have worked with. And I'm just so grateful for their work, and they're just wonderful people to work with. I was fortunate to be here when the Young Center developed, and that was at a time when there was just rising interest in the Amish, not a lot of interest. So what the Young Center provided me was a platform and a place to do my research. And it also expanded the name of the college and Amish studies to a really broad, wider base around the world, actually. And so to be able to be here and to be able to work in the Young Center at that time, I'm very grateful for. I just happened to come of age at a time when there was growing interest in the Amish. And so I'm saying between, and again, a lot of this starts with witness, the 80s and 90s and into the first decade of the 21st century, there's like rising interest in the Amish. I think we're at the place now where that's declining some. We're kind of like oversaturated with Amish stuff. And so there's not as much of an appetite for all things Amish now than there would have been like it was in the 80s or 90s. I also wanted to mention the National Endowment for the Humanities. They've been very good to me. They've funded, I've got 5 or 6 major grants from them. And all of this goes back to a summer seminar that I took at Yale University. This would have been probably in 1977. But Wayne Meeks in the Department of Religious Studies at Yale had this seminar, and these NEH seminars are like 6 weeks long, and they have typically a dozen students and a well-renowned faculty member. They hold them around the country. But what happened here was I was the only sociologist that applied, because this was in religious studies. And the fact that he selected me, I mean, I shouldn't have gotten on to that group. I mean, I'm surprised he selected me, because then that gave me a recognition with the National Endowment for Humanities, and having that as in my background really made it possible for me to get more, to have a lot of other influence from the NEH, and then I ended up working with them on some projects where we would evaluate project prospects and so on. So that was, so I feel like in all of these things, I've just been very fortunate to be at the right place where I could work and have great colleagues, and it was a great run.
You mentioned at the beginning there the Young Center. I feel like you've told me this before, but maybe you could, for the recording, how the Young Center was founded. It was during President Spiegler's?
Yes. So President Spiegler, I forget what the year is. He replaced Mark Ebersole, who was president, and I happened to be on the search committee for a faculty member, representative on the search committee for Spiegler. So after we met in Hershey for a meeting of the search committee, and then he said, Kraybill, he said, could we go out? He said, I'd like to go out to the college sometime. He said, are you going to be around? So we made an appointment. He wanted to just walk around. People wouldn't know who he was. And he said, what is the college doing to acknowledge and celebrate its history and its relationship to these Anabaptist groups? And I said, well, we have a historical library. This was down in the Zug, in the basement of Zug Library. And I said, there's a historical room down there. So we went down. It was all locked up, and they couldn't find a key to it. And so eventually somebody got the key, and it's like dusty in there. And the answer was, they're not doing anything. Well, and so he said, well, we should think about doing something to acknowledge or build on the heritage of the college. So after he became president, then he said to me, he said, why don't you write me a prospectus for a study center? He called it a study center. So I wrote a 3-page thing. And then he liked it and revised it, and there were some changes to it. And then he talked to Gale and Young, one of the trustees, and got him interested in it. And the rest is history. So I was fortunate again to be the right person at the right time, which, you know, to get the Young Center off the ground. And that opened, the other thing that is interesting here in terms of timing, that opened in 1989, which is right when my first Amish book came out. And so there, you know, I had the facilities and the book coming out, and it was just a nice bump up, so to speak, to working in Amish studies.
Yeah, and then there's all these scholars that are then coming through the Young Center.
Yes,
working
I
as
mean,
fellows.
there have been dozens and dozens of scholars. They come for a semester or just a 6-week term or whatever, the visiting scholars working on their projects. So it was a way to kind of expand the scope of the work through a lot of other people that way.
That actually leads me to another question that just occurred to me. When did the Young Center start working with Johns Hopkins University Press?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I know the answer. So when the Young Center started, one of the issues some people were pressing me, like I was the director of the Young Center early on. John Hostetler was here, the first scholar, but he wasn't working in the Young Center. The Young Center was being constructed while he was here. But anyway, so some people were saying, well, we ought to do a publication, you know, have a Young Center something. Well, I wasn't keen on that because it takes so much work to publish your own book. I mean, books are, it just takes an awful lot of work, and I wasn't sure we could do that. So at some point then, I talked with Johns Hopkins. I learned to know them through my book, The Real Amish Culture. So I talked to them about it and said, could we work out something where we would solicit books and you guys would publish them? So they did, and they were excited about it. And so that's the model that has developed. I was basically serving as the acquisitions editor for books, not mine, but for other scholars. And then we would go through them and vet them and help the author clean them up, so to speak. And then we would transmit them to Johns Hopkins, and they would publish them, and they took all the responsibility financially for this and to distribute them and market them. It was just great. It was a great deal because
and it continues today.
It helped them and it helped us. And we have about 25 books in that series that have been published that way. And so they've been happy to have them. We've been happy, and it's been a great wedding.
Yeah, and it continues the reach of the Young Center.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just Amish. It's like Hutterites, all kinds of Anabaptist and Pietist groups.
Very good. Is there anything else you'd like to share?
I think that's about it.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you for your good questions. I enjoyed the questions, and it brought back a lot of happy memories.
Yeah, we really appreciate you,
Yeah.
and we appreciate the time that you took to speak with us.
Yes.
Thank you.
My pleasure.